world are health issues and the impact they have on communities, on societies, on counties, on governments, and the global world because of our perception and our concern about those health threats. But I'm going to talk about the intersection of health with security, opportunity, that's the positive piece, and evolving demographics. But let me just pick up a minute from the brilliant debaters last night. Because when we talk about things that are fraying, there are things that we do together as a global community that have knit the US and Europe and Japan together in a unique way. And that is our investment in the Global Fund and against these three incredible pandemics, HIV, TB, and malaria. And we are making progress because we join together as bilaterals in a multilateral space. And so when we often talk about things fraying, around those things are hundreds of cables that are so much stronger than some of the things we perceive to be happening. And so if you went to Africa or you went to Asia, they recognize the work that you do through these multilateral and bilateral organizations. 80% of the global response to HIV, TB, and malaria is from Europe, the United States, and Japan. And that's the power of resources invested together for impact. And that's what we've been able to do. What has it forced us to do? Obviously, the United States is the largest bilateral donor. We're about 60% of the HIV response around the world. But for us to be successful, we not have to only work with host governments, but we have to work with the Global Fund, a multilateral organization. And although it's complicated and difficult at times, together we are so strong and we see the impact. So at the same time, and I want to recognize, because we have bipartisan people here from the United States, PEPFAR, which is the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, which has gone through 3 administrations, begun with President Bush, gone through President Obama with support, now in President Trump with support, 9 Congresses. We were just reauthorized in October by a huge bipartisan vote. So there are pieces that remain that are structural elements that unite us in our response to a global need. So what am I going to talk about? Obviously, there's a lot of global health threats. You don't have to look at the names. You just have to see there's a lot happening. What's happening? Well, there's microbial resistance. What does that mean? Malaria. That's becoming resistant to everything that we're doing. HIV, becoming resistant to the drugs that we're utilizing. TB, multi-drug resistance, extreme drug resistance, a very deadly disease. TB, XDR, extreme drug resistance, is difficult to cure. HIV, there's only been 2 people in the world that have been cured. There's no cure for HIV. It's 100% lethal without the drugs that we have today. And so these are lethal diseases. Also on this map, emerging diseases. Ebola, HIV, zoonotic events, animal to human transfers, happening all the time. Now, those of you who have pets, you're having human-animal transfer all the time. Cat scratch fever. Now, it's not deadly. But there are deadly viruses, there are deadly bacteria that are in animals that can be either transformed within the animal itself and then infect humans. HIV was what we call a simian immunodeficiency virus that was in sub-Saharan Africa for decades. But through multiple replications, it became adaptable to humans. And before we knew it, millions of people were infected. Because unlike Ebola, 14 to 21 day incubation period, HIV, you're healthy for 8 years. So you can be passing the virus to others for 8 years. So in order to have an effective response, you have to be able to reach people who perceive themselves to be well. That has been very difficult with young people and men. Men always think they're well until they're not. So this has been very difficult for us, and I'll go through some of that. Now, where does the insecurity and instability come in? As the instability and insecurity begins to move through sub-Saharan Africa into lower sub-Saharan Africa, that is when you hit Ebola, That is where you hit HIV, where up to a quarter of the adult population is already impacted and infected by HIV. Can you imagine, and the reason our Ebola response currently in the DRC has been slow is because of the insecurity in the region. Now, fortunately, it's in a fairly less populated region of the DRC, but it's very close to borders that lead into very cosmopolitan areas in Rwanda and in Uganda. And so this is a threat that is persistent, and I'll go through some of that data. Sometimes we get glib within the health system, and we'll say, or the health response, that if we just had more money, or if we had better systems, or the holy grail, universal health coverage, that certainly we would do better, and countries would do better. So I'm going to show you some maps. It's not, you don't need to know the names of the countries. It's meant to be particularly small, so you don't identify all the countries. But this is very telling. Countries with the most inefficient health system, ranked by WHO, have some of the greatest and most impactful responses to HIV and the most people on treatment. Now, what does it mean to have the most people on treatment? That means you have to be effective in rural areas. You have to be effective with men. You have to be effective in reaching young people. You have to be able to get to every mommy who's having a baby. That's what an effective HIV response is. So some of the weakest health system countries have the most incredible response. Sometimes people say to us, well, maybe it's how rich a country is. Now, the telling thing about this, and this is where all of you come in, countries over here, the poorest countries, have made the best and the most remarkable response. And that's where resources can have an impact. And so in countries that have a lower GNI, we've been able to bring resources to the table as a collective community and have an impact. Countries that have the money themselves, Thailand, Botswana, Namibia, Eswatini, previously Swaziland, those countries are funding more than 70% of the response. So this is the exciting piece about it. Every day we get to see host countries stepping up, investing in their own citizenry, and responding to the epidemic. And where countries need us, we've been there as an equity-based response. And what is an equity-based response? It means that we're focused on the people who actually need our support and our foreign assistance. The exciting piece about PEPFAR is it shows that foreign assistance can have a beginning, middle, and should have an end, because we will have controlled the pandemic, and countries will be able to maintain that control. So the universal health coverage has gotten a lot of play lately, but you can see the countries that have the lowest universal health coverage index, where HIV is the greatest, that I just shown you on the previous slide, they've been able to diagnose and treat 90% of their citizens. 90% of their citizens. Now, how is this possible? And I want to leave you with the concept that's very much about the world that you work in. Policies make a difference. So when countries have the health policies and the ability to create that environment that makes our money work, whether it comes from the EU through the Global Fund or any one of the bilateral programs, it is the policies that allow us to be effective. Not policies that are on a shelf where very many policies reside, but policies that become circulars down to the site. Circulars, in our case, that go to the health clinics, but in other cases should be going to the schools or going to the places of business. So this is what's possible, that you can overcome what many people would perceive as unrelenting structural barriers can be addressed when resources come together with an enabling policy environment where we've removed structural barriers to access. So I knew you'd want to hear about the latest Ebola outbreak. So this is where we are today. We continue to have new infections in this area of the DRC. The last outbreak, remember, was in 3 countries, cost us $53 billion. Now imagine if we had had that $53 billion. Obviously, as a global community, we can mobilize resources, because we mobilized the Europeans, the Japanese, the United States, mobilized $53 billion to combat the last epidemic. But that is money then that we didn't have for education or for women's empowerment or other health issues. So this is where it is geographically, just to give you a highlight. It's in that far corner over here in the DRC. This is Rwanda, Burundi, Uganda. A river and lake system, very porous borders. Now imagine if you're Uganda or Rwanda, you are worried, and they've done an extraordinary job across the borders to ensure that they're screening people. But remember I said 14 to 21 days asymptomatic. Imagine that you were exposed and now you're at Schiphol at day 14. That is a disruptor. That is what we're working to contain and to really, this is highly infectious. The virus is in 100% of your secretions when you're in the active phase. But remember, you're asymptomatic 14 to 21 days. You can be exposed and go anywhere. You will not show up that you have a fever. So these are the things that the global health community is working on collectively. This is HIV. And I wanted you to see where the burden of disease is. This is a cartogram that is by burden of disease. The darkness of the color is the prevalence of HIV. In many of these countries, the darkest countries, up to 25 to 30% of every adult in the country. In Swaziland, 50% of every woman over 30 is already HIV positive. So obviously, this is a huge disruptor. But through our collective work, we've been able to get 90% of all the women on treatment, and they're thriving, and they're not transmitting the virus to others. But the majority of the burden of the disease, 75%, resides in sub-Saharan Africa. So PEPFAR invests 95% of its resources into sub-Saharan Africa. And here's my last point. The continent of Africa is getting younger every day. These are the top 10, These are the top 10 countries with the lowest median age. All of them are in Africa. Niger is number 1, followed by Somalia. This is the rest of the globe. Some of us are older, including in this room. Median age, 18 in sub-Saharan Africa. So I think as a global community, as we're thinking about foreign policy, as we're thinking about these issues, are we thinking about the next generation in sub-Saharan Africa? Yes, they will be healthy because of already the investments that we are making together to achieve control of HIV, TB, and malaria by 2030. But will they be educated? Will they be employed? And I think this is our question as a global community of whether we're making the investments to ensure that there's a global dividend from this incredible group in sub-Saharan Africa, brilliant, now healthy, but are they educated, are they employed? This is why we're excited about being able to work in different administrations, because President Bush took on the issue of health in a global way, and collectively, the European and Japanese put in money to the global fund. And so together, we've invested about $130 billion over the last 16 years, and it's had a huge impact. But what are we investing in a global community and education? It was a call to action by Mrs. Obama in the last administration. The importance of secondary education being critical for young women in particular, who are often removed from access of secondary education. And this administration is focused on, employment. What can we do for young women to empower them, to give them the educational ability to move forward, the vocational training? And what I've been really excited about Ivanka Trump's program on this global women's initiative for development and prosperity is she's focused on the structural barriers that keep women from behind, where you have to have a male co-signer to get a loan for your business, where you can't have a bank account without a male, inheritance laws that skip the women. So in conclusion, I hope we see that it's not about how rich a country is, or how effective they look on paper by these analyses by WHO on health systems, or whether they have high universal health coverage. It's the political will of those governments to develop the policies that allow everyone to have access, whether you're a young woman seeking out information about reproductive health, whether you're a young male who needs information about risk groups because you're part of a population that has sex with men and you need to know that information. Are they welcomed? And finally, it's how the community perceives you. Does the community and its people view the health system as effective and affordable? Structural barriers like fees that become both formal and informal fees keep 50% of the population, mostly the in poverty population, away from health centers. So this is the predictor of global health security. It's whether your community believes that they're going to get services when they go to the health center. And that's very different than bricks and mortars and human resources. So finally, HIV epidemic is growing in young women, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. 4 young women are infected every year per 100. Over a decade, that means 40% of those young women are infected. That is what we're trying to combat. Every year they stay in school, you decrease their HIV risk, secondary school, by 1/3. And if they're employed, another 1/3. So that's how we intersect together. Health, education, opportunity. That is the answer to a lot of these global health security threats. Thank you.